All right. So let's just talk about Lucy. Let me orient you on what the mission is. So Lucy, NASA generally classifies missions as they're either competed or they're directed. And for competed missions, usually it's a scientist that has this brilliant science that they want to conduct, and they put together a proposal, and they compete with other scientists are usually in a category. And so Lucy is a competed mission. And what that means, Dr. Hal Levinson, who is the principal investigator, is beholden to NASA, to the agency, to make sure that Lucy is delivered on time, within its budget, and that it meets the science objectives. You don't typically have project managers that are external to the agency. And so NASA Goddard Space Flight Center here in Maryland and JPL are typically your project managers for a lot of your robotic missions in particular. And so this particular mission is managed out of Goddard, with myself as the project manager coming on right after the mission was confirmed. It is a Category 2 mission, risk class B. The importance around that, the category is typically tied to the budget, the life cycle cost, and Lucy was about $1 billion mission. Unlike JWST, which I think in the end ended up costing $25 billion. The risk classification will dictate the type of testing that you need to do to verify and demonstrate and have confidence that the mission will survive, that the spacecraft and the instruments will survive on orbit. So it will dictate the type of parts that you're allowed to use and the screening and so forth. Lucy is a longer mission, so it has about a 12-year mission lifetime. Because we are going out to the Trojan asteroids that are leading and trailing Jupiter. When the mission was selected, I think they were doing a total of 5 encounters and 1 main belt asteroid. But I think it was a total of 6 asteroids. We are now up to 9 asteroids. The first main belt asteroid that we were going to visit was Donald Johanson in 2025. And that asteroid was named after the archaeologist Donald Johanson, as his team discovered the Lucy fossil in Ethiopia in 1974. And the Lucy mission was named after that because the asteroids are believed to be fossils from the solar system. So that's where Lucy got its name. An interesting tidbit, if you look at the logo, the patch in the upper left corner, it's in the shape of a diamond. And when Donald Johanson and his archaeological team discovered that fossil, they happened to be listening to the Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And that's where they got the Americanized name Lucy for the fossil. And so Hal had the great idea to make our patch for the mission a diamond as well. And if you ever have an opportunity to actually see the patch in the upper left side, there's actually only an image of the fossil that was discovered. The science objectives really are to basically to figure out what these asteroids, the size, the composition, the density, the mass of a diverse set, which are called C, D, and P asteroids, which are different spectral types. Lucy formally has 3 science instruments. And because the mission is Lucy, they each have an L in front of their name. L. Ralph was built out of NASA Goddard. It's 2 instruments in one, a visual color imager and a near IR mapper. And then you have LTAS, which was built by Arizona State University, which is a thermal emission spectrometer. You have Lori, which was built by Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab here in Maryland. And then there are 2 cameras, which we call TT Cam, and they do the terminal tracking, and they worked amazing. Lucy actually did its first flyby of a smaller main belt asteroid recently. And I got some really exciting pictures to show you from that. We did launch out of KSC on an Atlas V launch vehicle. We launched as soon as our launch period opened, right at that second, 5:34 in the morning. It was a beautiful launch. It was dark. And it was quite exciting. The image that you see is actually, you can see it looking from the sun down, and you see the orbit of Jupiter with the leading and trailing Trojan asteroids that are at the Lagrange points. So what makes Lucy special? Let's see if I can get this going. Okay. So it's the trajectory, and we actually call it the pretzel trajectory. And so we first started off with a Earth gravity assist a year after launch, and that occurred last year, mid-October 2022, as planned. No issues. I'm actually going to show you some images that Ralph took during that EGA. And then it goes out and swings around, and it will do another Earth gravity assist. And that will occur next December 2024. And then it does the swing by, the encounter with Donald Johansen on its way out to the L4 swarm. And that is anticipated towards the end of April in 2025. So it's headed towards the L4 swarm. Now, one of the exciting things that we found unexpectedly right before we launched is that we found that Eurybates actually had a satellite. And so that's where one of our additional encounters are occurring. So it will first encounter Eurybates in August of 2027. And then Palomaly, which is a P-type, in September 2027. And then Lucas in April 2028. And finally with Ors, the last one in the L4 swarm. And then it will come back and do another swing around. And another Earth gravity assist, so the third Earth gravity assist. And then it will head out to the L5 swarm. And this, in the L5 swarm, will encounter the PM binary, Patroclus and Menetius. And that's in March of 2033. Okay. And so I talked about really what the Lucy mission is doing. It's all remote sensing, so it's not going to counter it. Literally zips by and takes pictures. TTCam, which is a terminal tracking, picks up on the target as it's approaching. And then the instruments are activated and they take images as the spacecraft flies by. And so that gave you an overview of what the mission is actually doing. I want to shift gears a little bit and kind of talk about ground development and some of the challenges that we had in getting Lucy delivered, even though we delivered it on time and actually delivered it under budget. So I mentioned that Lucy is a mission that was competed. And typically what happens, and in particular for this one, and this was a Discovery class mission, so you're mid-size, not as big as your New Frontiers missions are. similar to OREX, Discovery Class Mission, if you're familiar with OREX, which just returned samples back. This particular project, this mission was selected in December of 2016. And typically when you have a competed mission, the reason why these missions do so well is that Hal had actually been working with his partners for years to conceptualize and mature the design for the spacecraft and the instruments so that when they're typically selected, they've already completed the phase A, which is the pre-formulation effort that a lot of directed missions have to do. They've learned and they understand a lot of the risk and the challenges associated with trying to implement this mission, right? So they've already invested. And at this point, typically NASA has invested on the order of about 5 million into these competitions. And then they down select for step 2. And what's delivered out of that step 2 is what's called a concept study report. And in that concept study report, the team lays out the entire schedule. It's very detailed. This document is typically on the order of thousands of pages with all the foldouts and things. But they have a very comprehensive schedule that they've laid out and a budget associated with it, the plan and everything. And what's pretty amazing about Lucy is that this project had hit every single milestone that they had laid out in their schedule. So from the time that it was selected in December of 2016 and starting phase B, so they had a bridge phase in January of 2017 of 6 months. And then they started phase B in June of 2017, which is the preliminary design. And so that's when you're maturing the concept. That's when you're really getting an understanding of what your risks are, your industry partners, your commercial base and everything. So the project went through the preliminary design phase. That was a little over, you can see it was on the order of about 15 months. And after you go through preliminary design phase, NASA missions are not confirmed, meaning that at that point, the agency says, okay, I believe that you have a sound plan. I believe your budget. And so I'm going to commit to giving you funding to execute this mission. So typically confirmation KDPC, key decision point C, happens after your preliminary design phase. And so KDPC happened in October 30th, 2018 is when they went to KDPC. And KDPC then said, okay, now you can go into your critical design phase. And your critical design phase says, I have this preliminary concept. Now I'm going to mature it. Typically, your critical design phase is about a year. And then you go through another KDP decision point that allows you to start making hardware. I joined the team in October, the day after they went to confirmation. I joined the team as a deputy project manager on October 31st, 2018, and became the project manager 8 months later. The current project manager at that time had planned to retire, so I took over in August of 2019 as the project manager. And everything was going, I mean, as you would expect. It wasn't that we didn't have challenges. Typically, when you have a spacecraft, you want your instruments to be ahead of your spacecraft because usually that's where your technology development is. And so you're going to uncover challenges with your instrument and you'll have to make design changes. So we were already starting to see that there were some challenges with some of our instruments, uncovering things, especially when you have ones, even if you have instruments that have high heritage, you never fly the same instrument twice. There's always some changes. And so you do uncover some things. But we were still managing, in spite of those challenges, to hold to our schedule. But then COVID came. And COVID came, the agency implemented their COVID response framework in March. And around mid-March, the agency went out and said to all 10 centers, right, all 10 field centers, they recommended that we go to telework. Not mandatory at this point, but that we go to telework. Now, at this point, we were about 6 months, 7 months from when we were slated to start spacecraft integration. So all the instruments had hardware. Ralph in particular was testing in the TVAC chamber. And within a matter of less than 5 days, we went from, hey, we're not sure what's going on, you all should consider telework to the extent possible, to all of the to headquarters issuing a directive that all the centers go to mandatory telework and safe all the hardware. The only projects that were allowed to continue to work with limited people on site were those that were deemed mission essential. So those that were on orbit and were operating, they needed those individuals and JWST. So by April 1st, Ralph at Goddard had to shut down. And you can see here all of my industry partners. So I talked about the fact that Goddard was responsible for Ralph instrument, project management, project systems engineering, and project mission assurance. Spacecraft was built by Lockheed Martin out in Denver. SWIRI, Southwest Research Institute, is the PI institution, but they were also responsible for the electronics for LRALPH. And in particular, they were responsible for MVIC, which is one of the channels or one of the instruments. LRALPH is two instruments, as I mentioned, MVIC and LISA. Lockheed Martin was responsible for mission operations as well as the integration of the spacecraft and all of the instruments. I mentioned Arizona State University was responsible for LTES. Kinetics in California was responsible for navigation. KSC provided launch services. By April the 1st, every single one of my partners were either under a mandatory telework order or their state had issued a stay-at-home order. So that meant that Ralph was dead in the water. They had to bring the instrument up. It was in TVAC. They had to bring it up to ambient and they had to safe it. We had no idea how long we were going to be in that mode. I immediately started making a case for the agency to give us an exception. And the basis of that exception was the planetary launch window. Lucy had two launch opportunities, two launch windows. The first was mid-October of 2021. The second was a year later in 2022. If we missed both of those, then we would not be able to survey these targets. Hal would have to change the basis of his science and identify additional targets. So there was a lot to balance. As I said, I immediately tried to come up with a justification to get an exception for Lucy. I also was working to get a DPAS rating for my other partners in other states to see if I could get an exception so that they would be able to work. But more than anything, at this time, we were uncertain. I mean, we didn't know what really the coronavirus was going to do. If you recall, this was very early. Having conversations with Hal as the PI, he wanted to shut down. He wanted us to go to headquarters and get approval to stand down for a year and work towards that backup window. I can tell you that I did an assessment. At a minimum, that would have cost us $80 million at a minimum. And we were a cost cap mission if we had to delay a year. And so I immediately reached out. My team spread across. I had over 1,000 people on my team, and had a conversation with folks just to check in and say, how's everyone doing? Are you concerned? Do you feel comfortable if we figure out a way to proceed? And if after having a conversation in particular with my senior leadership team and them talking with their team, I reached out to Hal and I said to him, and I had to convince him because this is a PI-led mission. So ultimately he has decision authority. I work for him, with delegated responsibility. But what I said to him was, if you trust me, I assure you that I will get us to launch on time and I will keep the team safe. And so I was able to convince him and our project scientist and the deputy PI of that case. And I will tell you that when I talked to my team, they were all singly minded, committed to this mission. Nobody wanted to, even though we didn't know what the future held, no one wanted to stand down and take that year. We were all convinced that we could figure out a way to do it. And ultimately we did. I show you the next slide because in addition to COVID, there were other things, right? You had technical challenges that threatened our ability to get to launch. And so in the meantime, we had an issue. I talked about the fact that the instruments were having challenges. And as a project manager, I report out every month to my leadership at Goddard, as well as to headquarters, on the status of the project and some of the metrics that we track and report out on, in addition to our risk, our issues. And this is just a snapshot of some of the issues, right? And issues are either red, green, or yellow. A red issue says that this has the potential of violating my launch date or my budget, right? And in particular, this particular one was associated with some of the challenges that the L-test instrument was having. And if we weren't able to overcome those, then that could have potentially impacted my ability to meet my launch readiness date. We had issues. Our solar arrays, you're going to see some pictures when I show you the collage, right? If you deploy our solar arrays and stand the spacecraft in the solar array, stand it on its edge, the spacecraft would span 5 stories. These were big solar arrays, right? When they were deployed, Northrop had flown solar arrays designed like this, but they were smaller. And what we were seeing was the supplier was not able to keep up with, Solero wasn't able to keep up with manufacturing because there were some challenges that we were finding in scaling up to these larger solar arrays. And so we had to put a lot of resources to trying to figure out what the challenges were. I sent my technical folks out there every month to be on the floor, to understand the manufacturing and to help them come up with strategies to figure out how we could increase production. So that was one of the things. In addition to, so their schedule was being eroded, right? And they had missed their initial delivery date. So that required us to figure out how can we integrate them later, and still, work around, and still maintain our schedule to our launch date. In addition, the particular launch vehicle that we were using, and so there was an issue with the launch vehicle in that some of the supplies that we had were provided by Russia, and they were old and aged, and there was concern as to whether or not we'd be able to use them. In addition to that, the hydrazine that we use for our spacecraft, there was a limited amount of that hydrazine because the company had changed the formula. And so we were competing with other missions and had to go to the agency again to lobby for us getting priority to the old hydrazine, right? Because there was risk associated with that. So that was a potential issue. And then our propulsion system, our tanks, when they were welding them up, the welds failed, um, and they failed repeatedly. And so we had to figure out at Lockheed Martin what was contributing to that failure. So all of these things on top of COVID were threatening our launch readiness date. So one of the things I did to try to overcome the potential impact of COVID was several things, and we called it FAST, the acronym FAST, which stood for feasible at low, shortened timeline. And so, first thing I did with my team, folks that weren't comfortable traveling didn't travel. Folks that weren't comfortable being on site were not required to go on site. We set up things so that people could participate remotely. So we use things like FaceTime and GoPro and cameras looking over the shoulder, and my mission assurance folks doing inspections virtually, because we certainly weren't traveling to Europe and we had some European suppliers. We implemented these things so that if people weren't comfortable traveling, or they had a family situation that really wasn't conducive to them traveling or being on site, right? Concern about people being exposed and getting sick, then we set up these things so that people could participate remotely. It was particularly challenging because we were on the East Coast. My leadership team, predominantly spacecraft hardware development, right, was happening in Denver, 2 hours difference, right? So we found ourselves with very long days. I can tell you that I traveled, because we felt like if our folks were going to put themselves at risk, then we were going to travel and be on site with them as well. And so I think that year I spent 171 nights in a hotel. I have a very accommodating and understanding husband who also works for NASA, so he gets it. Other things that we did, I talk about it later about, throwing money at things. But I had very healthy reserves. And so I was actually able to set up two different teams. So at Lockheed Martin, we called them the red and blue team. They were the engineers and your operators, your test conductors, and then my technicians were the green and orange team. And so what we did is we went to a 7-day work week. That's why it's fast, feasible at low, shortened timeline. I basically compressed the schedule. And what I did was I had one team that worked from Monday to Wednesday, and then another team that worked Wednesday to Sunday. And they never physically came in contact with each other. So there was a lot of very good documentation. By keeping the two teams separate, that mitigated the risk of somebody getting sick, catching COVID, and then the whole team having to isolate, right? I will tell you that I never had a stop work because someone got sick. In addition to creating the 4 different teams that never came in contact with each other, the red, blue, orange, green, we instituted very stringent COVID mitigation. So social distancing, even in the clean rooms, right? We figured out a way for people to be able to move hardware and work on hardware and maintain social distancing. We did the health checks every day. Everyone was required to do health checks. They wore masks, they wore gloves, we sanitized, we cleaned, all of the things that, if you all recall, that we did back then, we implemented. And I established a framework across all of my partner institutions. Everyone operated the same, even at the instruments, because at this point they hadn't been delivered. Same thing. So not just at the spacecraft, but at each of the instrument institutions as well. In the meantime, I was successful in convincing the agency to give us an exception. It took a month and a half to get that. And so Ralph was at a standstill for about 7 weeks before that team was allowed to come back and resume work. So we are now in the June timeframe, and we're supposed to start spacecraft integration and testing at the end of July. We did it. Everything that we did, all of the protocols that we put in place worked. And we actually started integration and testing a week earlier than we planned. And so these are the pictures of INT at Lockheed Martin. And you can see that folks are wearing masks, and you can see, I mean, typically in a clean room of this size, you would certainly see a lot more people than you see here. One of my favorite pictures is this one here, which is one of the solar arrays deployed in the TVAC chamber. Obviously, we couldn't test the solar arrays mounted to the spacecraft, fully deployed in the TVAC chamber. And so we had to test it with some GSC. That just shows you how big that solar array is. One of the things that the team did, so we did a lot of, folks have asked me, how is it that Lucy was successful? And I would say that Lucy had a lot of social equity going into COVID, that this team was a very close team. We traveled a lot before COVID, so we socialized a lot. We knew each other. We knew each other's families. It really was like a family. And so during COVID, we came up with ideas to maintain that relationship and that camaraderie. You can see that we actually had a mask designed, right, with the Lucy logo on it. We would do happy hour virtually every Thursday. We would do games virtually, virtual bingo, all kinds of things to just maintain. I mean, we were craving that relationship, right? Because we weren't just a project, we really were like a family and friends. And I think that that's one of the main reasons why we were able to be successful. So we got through the integration phase. And we were slated in the CSR to start our environmental test campaign in February of 2021. So hardware was late. The propulsion system was not delivered in ATLO when it was supposed to be delivered. And so we had to build some GSC to do the integration and then move that hardware onto the structure after the propulsion system was delivered. All three instruments, actually, Lori and Ralph were late. No, Eltas and Ralph was late. Lori actually showed up pretty much on time. But we had, as part of our risk mitigation strategy, had already worked out a plan anticipating that hardware was going to be late. And so one of the things that I had my systems team do, because the systems engineer are responsible for the technical excellence and the technical integrity of the mission, right? They're the ones that have to stand up at the SMISR, the safety review, and say, yes, this mission is ready to launch, right? One of the things that I had them do when we were first talking about COVID and the potentiality of hardware being late is to look at our environmental and our integration plan and identify windows of opportunity to integrate late hardware based on test as you fly exceptions, because to the extent possible on the ground, you try to test as you would fly, right? To make sure that you can have confidence that you're not going to uncover something on orbit that you haven't seen on the ground. Well, late hardware delivery means my first comprehensive performance test, where I have the spacecraft and the avionics and all the instruments integrated before I go in environments, may not have my hardware. And so what's the risk associated with that? Do I need to do regression testing? Do I need to do something else? Do I need to do a simulator? Because I anticipated that the instruments were going to be late, I spent money to build mass simulators for the instruments, which would have allowed me to do the mechanical testing, the vibration testing with simulators if the instruments were late. All of this planning costs money, right, to do it. But in the end, I didn't have to exercise those contingencies because all of the hardware got delivered in time enough for me to start my environmental test campaign in February as planned, 2021. Everything from the welds to the solar arrays to the instruments, everything showed up in time for me to go through the nominal environmental test campaign. And we went through the full shake and bake. So EMI, TVAC, thermal balance, Vibe, mass properties, everything from February to June. It only took us 4 months to get through that full test campaign. And we delivered to KSC on the same date that was said that this team said they would do 6 years before. In their concept study report, we said we would ship on July 30th, 2021, and we did. We shipped to Florida. Now, Florida came with challenges as well. There was not a lot of community adherence to the COVID protocols, and we had been operating in this manner for about 8 months, 7 months at this point. Folks had gotten comfortable. We knew how to do it. And now we were transitioning from Denver with a large team down to Florida, different environment. And so we had to figure out how we were going to operate, different team of people, right? Those supporting the ground ops. And not only that, we were competing with missions that were occupying the space that we needed. And so I had to negotiate with GOES to make sure that I could get access. And then there were launches that were planned on the same launch pad that we were utilizing that were being delayed because of weather, which potentially, again, could impact us. So it was a constant mode of negotiating with headquarters, right, at this point. But ground operations, again, we followed the schedule. We rolled out to the pad as planned, in spite of all of those challenges and perturbations. We had enough reserves and contingency in our schedule that we were able to accommodate some of the unanticipated challenges that we saw once we got down there. And then, as I said, we launched at 5:34 that morning. Beautiful launch. One of my favorite pictures. I mean, I was on control. But I did get to go out to actually stand above the rocket and take a picture. That was pretty cool. And so what were the keys to our success? Triple constraints. So anytime you have a mission, your time, your schedule, your cost, and your performance is your constraints. Your level 1 requirements come from the agency. For PI-led missions, the PI negotiates with headquarters specifically what those success criteria are. And so you have those constraints. And while you have some flexibility, typically for missions, you have full success criteria versus minimum success criteria. Again, that requires negotiation. Risk is a pivotal factor in all of the decision making. One of our mantras was schedule was king. Above all else, schedule was the priority. And then everything else was evaluated around schedule. And the importance is I'm an engineer. Engineers don't necessarily like to make decisions that they feel will compromise, perhaps not in a bad way, the integrity, right? They're gonna polish that apple, that gold apple, as much as they can, right? But when you're balancing, you have to be willing to accept less performance You have to be willing and be comfortable with ambiguity, because you don't have time to do a lot of the analysis that people would be more comfortable doing. And so it was constant. I was always pushing the team. It's good enough, right? I would always ask, what's my risk exposure? What is the um, reasonable worst case thing that could happen, right? And then from that, I would balance, and then I would direct the team one way or another based on the options around that. Always had contingencies with exit ramps off. And it worked like a charm because we had done the work ahead of time. Um, as I said, healthy reserves. And so I was willing to spend money to help mitigate things, to buy more hardware, to test something offline to prove that it was not going to be an issue. I didn't talk about the reaction wheels, but the vendor delivered our reaction wheels. And then later, one of their other programs, they uncovered a performance issue, which potentially indicted our reaction wheels. Not only our bearings and our reaction wheels, but also the control electronics. And so there was about a 3 or 4 month Tiger team that was put together to evaluate that, with experts pulled from everywhere. I believe in having internal and external rights so that you don't get groupthink. Um, and I had to decide whether or not I thought the risk, based on the information that was provided, was significant enough to pull those reaction wheels off of the spacecraft. We were in INT, and or pull the electronics off the spacecraft and rework them. I was convinced enough to pull the reaction wheels off. So we pulled the reaction wheels off and we sent them back. But I thought the risk with the electronics was, I was convinced that it was sufficiently low that I didn't need to do that. Had I needed to have the electronics repaired, it would have delayed our launch by a year. With the reaction wheels, we pulled them off one at a time. And so it allowed us to test them individually. They got reworked, they came back, we integrated them, and so it allowed us to continue to make progress in our INT. So all of those decisions were constant, evaluating, right, where my risk balance is, where my risk exposure is. I can't speak enough to the third bullet. This team was unwavering and committed to the success. It didn't matter. We all were determined that we were going to do whatever it took. We didn't want to disappoint Hal. Hal had spent his life, right, trying to get this mission off the ground, and we wanted to do it for him. Across the board, everyone wanted to do it for him. And so it was constant trades. Sometimes on projects, there's a competition, right? There's limited resources, so people hold to their resources. They don't want to relax their requirements, right? It wasn't like that on Lucy. And it was pretty amazing to see. I've been at NASA for 32 years, and I've not worked a mission like Lucy before. I have to give it to Hal. He's like a flower child, and that's the way that was the climate and the culture of this project. It was a familial culture, teamwork and partnership. You talk about one badge. It was one badge. Quite often, I've seen project managers that hedge, and they don't necessarily like to share information with your contract partners, right? We didn't do that. We laid everything out, from budget, money, schedule, everything, right? Everything was laid out with everyone, and we sat and we talked about what we needed to do in order to get there. I talked about the traveling, Hal and myself, we very much believed in the man in the arena. We were going to be there. We were going to be on site. I spent 3 months from the time that spacecraft shipped to Florida until we packed up. I was in Florida. I didn't travel home for those 3 months that we were down there. The team was down there, and I was determined to be there with them. And so I want to show you some pictures that were actually taken by some of our instruments. So I showed you the trajectory, and these are actual photos that were taken by L. Ralph Vic of the moon doing EGA1. And these are pictures that Lisa, which is part of L. Ralph, was taken. And it is this band that is in the middle. And it's kind of comparing to what you see with the Veers instrument, and then with the Modus instrument that's on Aqua. And then more recently, so I guess maybe on the order of maybe about 4 months ago, the science team, the Lucy science team, one of the scientists, and I don't recall who, in doing, and even still, that team does some ground observations. And so in their analysis, they found that on our way out, Lucy was going to pass by this small main belt asteroid. And so Hal negotiated with headquarters to get approval to actually turn on the instruments and do this encounter. And the benefit of doing this, so one of the benefits of doing the Donald Johanson encounter, right, is to allow the operations team to run through all of the scripts and all the planning that they were going to do on a main belt asteroid before they get out to the Trojan swarms. So they were flying very closely by this asteroid, and so they got concurrence to do an encounter with this one. What's fascinating about this one, and they ended up naming it Dinkinish. What's fascinating about this one is my understanding is maybe a few hours or a day before they were going to do an encounter, they suspected that Dinkinish had a satellite. So they suspected that Dinkinish had a satellite, but they didn't know that it was going to be a satellite that was actually two smaller asteroids that were in contact with each other. This is a phenomenon that had not been seen before. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of excitement around this. And the images that you see are actual images that were taken. They're not simulations. So the science team and Hal and company are quite excited to have discovered this. I think the images that you see here might have been taken by TT Cam. These images were taken by L. Ralph, and obviously they're still processing the data. Then my last slide, I always like to acknowledge, right? A mission success begins and ends with a great team. And this truly was a great team for sure. So that's it.
Thank you. I think that was a fascinating look behind the scenes of what goes into these launches. You know, we hear about them and you know, a lot of times we hear about the results. But I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about, you know, the process of getting this, you know, getting the satellite up there, or not the satellite, but getting the machine up there, especially especially during COVID time. That I can't imagine what the feeling must have been when you got the notice to you know to you know that nobody can come into the office or into the buildings, you know, and to actually get things out on schedule. Um, just kudos to you and the team.
Yeah, and we actually came in under budget. So we came in $50 million under our
Huh.
budgeted life cycle cost. And yeah, I was interviewed by GAO. They wanted to understand how Lucy had done it, especially since a lot of the missions during that time were experiencing significant cost growth and schedule delays.
I have a question.
Sure.
Um, you mentioned C, D, and P types for the Trojan asteroids. Does C stand for carbonaceous, and are those stony or metal? I collect meteorites, so I'm always curious about, the asteroid meteorite collection. So can you elaborate on C, D, and P asteroids, please?
Unfortunately, I cannot.
Okay.
As the project manager, my science is very
Yeah,
limited.
yeah. All right.
But
Okay.
Dr. Hal Levinson has given many talks, and I think if you Google, especially if you go to the Lucy website, I think it talks about
Okay.
what the
Hello. Excuse me, Donya. This is Jonathan Grady. I have an answer to Greg's question,
Oh,
Okay.
great.
direct from the source. And first, I want to congratulate Donya on a very successful project management mission. I've been involved with space missions since, believe it or not, Pioneer 10 and 11 in with the imaging photopolarimetry with Tom Gerrels. I was an undergraduate at the University of Arizona at the time. And we, as scientists, depend absolutely critical on people like you to make these missions a success. As scientists, we would have nothing. We would just have pieces of parts in our hands still lying here on Earth. So congratulations on that. But to get to Greg's question about the CPD classification of asteroids, back in the mid-1970s, when asteroids were being examined with spectroscopy, like your spectroscopic instrument, but mostly with UBV photometry, and then with infrared imaging, thermal infrared with Dale Cruikshank and Dave Morrison at the University of Hawaii, began recognizing that some asteroids had different reflectivities and different thermal properties and different colors, et cetera. And that developed the classification of CMS. The C was, well, we have carbonaceous chondrites. These things are dark. Let's call them Cs. We have stuff that look like stony irons. Let's call these things S. And then the M asteroids, the metallic asteroids, of which 16 Psyche is the archetypal one, that excuse me, I have a granddaughter here who's trying to read to me, that the M asteroids we use a technique called polarimetry to distinguish those from other stony irons. But the particular thing about the P's and the D's that exist in the outer edge of the solar system, excuse me, the outer asteroid belt toward Jupiter and then the Trojans, is particularly because not only are they dark like the C's, but they're very red. And the red, excuse me, I'm going to have to go over here. The red is caused by the unique type of carbonaceous material in there, we believe, which is red because it's not just carbon, but it's, I'll use the word kerogen. That sounds biogenic, but it is very complex hydrocarbons that we believe are in these P and D asteroids. So identifying and saying, hey, what are these P's and what are these D's? That's what the Lucy mission actually is hoping to help find out. And I'm not part of the Lucy mission. I'm an observer living vicariously because I'm now retired doing other things. But it's a really, you asked, Greg, you've asked just the question, which is all the scientists have been asking for the last 40 years. So very good. All right. And again, I want to congratulate the Lucy, the Lucy mission on just a remarkable mission. I hope I live long enough to see the results that come out of it, and then stand around the fireplace at night drinking my whiskey saying, hey, I remember back in the day. Okay, thank you. I'm going to take off. Bye.
Thank
you. Any other questions? Anybody else? Anybody on?
I'd like to ask a quick question, if I may. Was any of the testing, as far as vibration and heat and acoustics and whatnot, was any of that done at Goddard in Maryland?
The testing for the LRF instrument was done at Goddard.
The reason
But-
I ask is when I was in grad school, part of our program had us visit Goddard, and what an impressive place, especially if you're into acoustics. I mean, they had what I think was a woofer that was about 24 feet in diameter, one of
Yeah.
many. I mean, they could probably, if they took the building away, they could probably send sound worldwide. I mean, it was just an incredible, extreme set of circumstances they subject these spacecraft to. And since the years I've been there, I'm sure that they've perfected that array of test equipment.
It is pretty impressive. And right now we are testing the Roman Space Telescope in our facility, as well as the OSAM spacecraft. And PACE, which launches in February, just completed within the last year its environmental testing at Goddard. So yes, pretty impressive facility.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. This is Jeff. I do have a question. So I was just wondering, looking at your animation of kind of the multiple Earth flybys and then all of these intercepts with asteroids, I'm just wondering if either, the uncertainty in the exact position of the spacecraft, or perhaps the asteroids, which I imagine is somewhat complex there in those Trojan belts, and perhaps not every little gravitational tug by other objects is known or predictable. Was there much uncertainty, or how was that handled as far as, you have little maneuvering thrusters? What's going on to kind of help you align?
Yeah, all the above. So there's a number of things that we do. So Hal and the science team continue to do their ground-based observations regularly. They were doing them prior to launch, right? And doing their mapping of where the asteroids. So they had a pretty good idea of the size and shapes of the asteroids before we launched. And then orbital mechanics, right? Tracking again with those ground-based. And then we do have thrusters where we can do maneuvers. We're not coming very close to them, although it may seem like we're coming very close to them. We're not. So we're not at risk of running into them or experiencing any type of gravitational pull from them. But the orbital mechanics and the knowledge and the tracking of them is continuous, both ground-based as well as with the spacecraft.
That's very good. Thank you. One follow-up, you said you don't get very close. How close, just maybe to the closest one?
I knew you were going to ask me that. I don't. So I think Dinkish is, I think, the one that we got the closest to. And I don't see, but yeah, I think this is the one we got closest to. I'll get that answer and I'll send it to Chris.
All right, thanks. Yeah, just curious. Yeah,
Sure.
Thank you. Great talk again.
Yeah, let me make a note to myself. Any other questions?
So what's going on with the Mars sample return mission?
So Mars sample return, as you've seen probably in some of the articles that's been written, Mars sample return is comprised of two missions, which is the lander and the Earth return mission, which has a ESA led spacecraft with a Goddard provided payload. They are in the process, in response to the independent review board assessment that was completed in the summer. There were some recommendations that came out of that with regards to re-architecting Mars sample return. And so the MERT team has been looking at different configurations and different architecture to build more robustness in the mission itself, as well as looking at different options for adding robustness, in particular with the lander. And so there's a smaller team that's looking at that is going to report out to SMD leadership in the spring timeframe.
That sounds a lot like potential budget expansion.
I think the intent is to try to keep the budget from expanding.
I'm glad you asked that, Bill. I was wondering about that too, because there seems to be the road's a little bumpy at this point in its development, I think.
I think so. If you read the report, I think the IRB had some recommendations for certainly and some very candid feedback on adhering, trying to get back into the box, right, of what the original Decado said the costs for Mars should be. And I think the agency is doing the right thing by given where we are. And remember, I talked about confirmation. Mars sample return has not gone to confirmation yet. So the agency hasn't signed up to anything yet. So I think this is the right time to step back and figure out, okay, is there something that we need to do differently with this overall program to give confidence that we will be able to execute it within the commitment that we sign up with the agency. I know I sounded like a politician, but.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of moving pieces there. Are you going to have an opportunity, or have you already had an opportunity to do some of the magic that you did with Lucy and build a team that has that type of focus that Lucy had?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, just last week, we completed our preliminary design review, and it was quite successful. And this team, I've been quite impressed with this team. I joined this project in April and took over as the PM in June. And within 3 months, we optimized the structure of the payload, and my team came with the full scale mock-up. It's pretty amazing what they've accomplished.
Well, best of luck on that project, and we're all gunning for you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you also for giving us a look under the covers for the Lucy mission too. I got to say though that orbit is wild. Somebody was really smoking something to come up with that.
Yeah, it was a couple flight dynamicists came up with that. One guy at Lockheed Martin and then a guy at Goddard. They call it the pretzel diagram.
Right. Any more questions? I think we got a couple more minutes and then I really need to move on.
Well, I'd sure like to say thank you. That was just excellent. As Bill said, a look under the hood or under the covers at what we see in the mission and all the glory stuff that comes back. As Bill said, there's so many moving parts we're not aware of, and I'm sure that politics is a part of the whole thing.
It takes a lot to get there. No one thinks about what it takes to get there once you launch and you get those images, right? But it takes a lot
True.
to get
Right. Yeah. We get to see the calendar photos. But yeah, thank you. Again, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us.
Donya, you rock.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. You all have a good night.